Hello, and welcome to Women in the Resistance, the third installment of the Power of Our Stories series, a virtual panel brought to you by the New Krakow Friendship Society. I'm Elizabeth Schanzer, and I have the privilege of serving on the board of this extraordinary organization. We are a nonprofit founded by and for Holocaust survivors and subsequent generations from Krakow, Poland, and Polish Galicia. After watching today's webinar, please consider making a donation to our organization. All donations will go towards our welfare fund so that we may continue supporting survivors and those from our community who need a little extra help. The link to donate is located in the chat. At this time, let me introduce you to my fellow board member and chair of our Social Action Committee, Ana Gallegos.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is from our survivors that we learn the immeasurable value of retelling. And today we are going to learn a little bit about the stories of women in Krakow, Poland, who participated in Holocaust resistance. I'm very pleased to introduce our panel of incredible women. First up, we have our moderator, Dr. Lori Weintrob. Lori is a professor of history and founding director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center in New York. Dr. Weintrob is co-editor of Beyond Bystanders, Educational Leadership for a Human Culture in a Globalizing Reality, and is currently working on a book on female resistance fighters. Lori will co-chair the International Symposium, Heroines of the Holocaust, New Frameworks of Resistance in June 2022 at Wagner College. She is proud to have connected over 5,000 students in New York and New Jersey to Holocaust survivors, including our very own Arthur Spielman, who survived the Krakow ghetto. Next up, we have Sheryl Ochayon. Since 2005, she's been working at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. She has written and administered online courses for students all over the world and created a number of educational videos. Since 2015, she has been curating content, creating classroom materials, and facilitating professional development as Yad Vashem's program director for Echoes and Reflections, a program that empowers American educators to teach about the Holocaust with confidence. She has authored numerous articles and has represented Yad Vashem in venues around the world, including at the United Nations. Finally, we have Dr. Edyta Gawron. She's assistant professor at the Institute of Jewish Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. From 2009 to 2017, she was director of the Center for the Study of the History and Culture of Krakow Jews. She is president of the management board of Galicia Jewish Heritage Institute Foundation at the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, and served on the team that designed the historical museum in Oskar Schindler's factory in Krakow. During this discussion, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as possible at the end of our discussion. Lori, take it away.
Thank you. I want to express my gratitude to the New Krakow Friendship Society for inviting us here to discuss our research about women and all forms of resistance. I had the pleasure to attend the 50th anniversary celebration of the founding of your organization as a guest of Arthur Spielman, who grew up in Krakow. A year earlier, I had led a class of 18 students, faculty, and parents on a tour of Krakow. Arthur's tragic history, from pre-war anti-Semitism in schools to witnessing the deaths in the ghetto, guided our understanding of the Holocaust. So too did hearing him tell youth in local schools of his efforts to flee across the border and live with false Christian papers. It all took courage. How to confront anti-Semitism and hate is a critical issue today, whatever nation we live in. There are many lessons about how to resist and how to stand up to anti-Semitism and fascism that come from those who risked their lives in Krakow and beyond to stand up to hate during the Holocaust. To empower future generations in empathy, courage, and ethical decision-making in order to combat anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of prejudice is the mission of the Holocaust Center at Wagner College and of our upcoming Heroines of the Holocaust Symposium. Women leaders were instrumental in fighting back against anti-Semitism and Nazism. Women were critical to the Jewish underground and resistance networks in many countries as armed fighters, as strategists and couriers of intelligence and false papers, as journalists and medical personnel, and as smugglers of Jewish children. Often overlooked, over 3,000 women as well as men played critical roles in resistance movements from France to Morocco and uprising against the Nazis in over 50 ghettos, 18 forced labor camps, and 5 concentration camps, including Auschwitz. Over 100,000 Jewish women fought in the Soviet and Allied military, including as combat pilots. 12,000 non-Jewish women are listed as righteous Gentiles. In examining Jewish actions in World War II, defiance and nonconformity were more common than often perceived. The Hebrew term Amidah, which translates as stand up, captures the actions of many Jews, both within and outside organized resistance groups. As one of the leading historians of women in the Holocaust, Judy Baumel-Schwartz has written, quote, "Women, Heroism, and the Holocaust evokes a broad spectrum of associations, from resistance fighters to self-sacrificing mothers, underground couriers to religious martyrs. I ask, why can we name the perpetrators but not the resistors? There are many models of upstanders critical at this moment for educating the next generation. Models like the partisan Faye Shulman in Lithuania, whose nursing and photography skills were highly valued in documenting resistance. Those who survived and those who perished care deeply that the world know that Jews, particularly Jewish women, resisted." Although feminist scholars have been studying the topic of women in the Holocaust for over 30 years, resistance has received more scholarly and public attention only recently. And I will show in a minute the murals in Warsaw this April of 2021 for Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, honoring female resistance fighters described as forgotten heroes. Before turning to our esteemed scholars, I'd like to point out a few specific contributions of Krakow women. I'm just now going to share my screen. Just a picture of Arthur Spielman, a picture of Faye Shulman's strong defense of resistance, and a picture of the murals, including some of the women with guns in Warsaw. Several women from Krakow, notably Hella Schipper, insisted on the term heroism to discuss the courage and sacrifice of young fighters and strategists. Hella smuggled arms and ammunition between the Warsaw and Krakow ghettos after dyeing her hair a lighter color. One of the unique contributions of the Krakow Resistance Network is that, like the Oneg Shabbat in Warsaw, a record of its actions was penned during the war itself by Gusta Tova Davidson Draenger, leader of Akiva and editor of Zirim. Written in her cell despite Gestapo torture of her hands, it exemplified one female resistance strategy: to use communication to enhance solidarity and emphasize hope. And this is one of the features that we want to look at, is not just resistance generally, but the way in which it's strategic, how it exemplifies leadership. Gusta described Hella's dangerous exploits this way. Everyone waited tensely for the weapons, and one bright morning, Hella returned from Warsaw smiling, well-dressed, and carrying a new travel bag. She walked with her own special confidence, head erect. Several times she traveled back and forth, each time entering the Warsaw ghetto, where she ran the risk of being trapped for good. Those traveling with her never dreamed that she was smuggling weapons. No one had ever been welcomed with as much excitement as Hella was now. No one will ever understand how much we rejoiced over the weapons that had been obtained and which were now ours. Hella was not only a courier, but she was she was present at the founding and one of the founders of the Jewish Fighting Organization. And she was one of the 2 women from the Krakow resistance movement who testified after the war, further exemplifying their strength post-war at the trial of Adolf Eichmann. As the headquarters of the Nazi government in Poland, overseen by SS legal counsel Hans Frank, Krakow was at the epicenter of the death camps and the final solution, and the Krakow resistance has several other unique features within the history of the Holocaust. The fighters in Krakow decided to work primarily outside the ghetto, partly because of the size of the ghetto, only 20,000 Jews compared to 400,000 in Warsaw. Its leaders, however, were able to coordinate one of the earliest and most successful and visible attacks of the Jewish resistance fighters against the Nazis in December of 1942. In part, this was possible because of a female catalytic leader, Gola Meir. After the death of her infant son, Gola drew her friends in the Krakow ghetto together with those she had worked with in the Polish Workers' Party. At a critical moment in January of 1942, as rumors and evidence of Ponery and Chelmno spread, she was able to, in the words of Gusta, she was able to provoke, quote, the urge of members of Akiva to go out and fight alongside the PPR. Historian Dina Porat agrees. And both Mira and Gusta were poetic writers, not only leaders and strategists, but their poetry expressed both their longing, their ideological, interests and passions, and their techniques of rousing others. As Mira taught these poems to those cellmates of hers in prison, where she was imprisoned with Gusta. And both of our speakers will elaborate further on these individuals. However, by March 1943, Gola was captured and sent to prison, where she taught her cellmates these poetry, originally written in Yiddish and Hebrew, and she and Gusta together planned an escape on April 19th, 1943. And if some of you have followed the more recent publication of Judy Battalion's book, In the Light of Days, about female resistance fighters, you know that there were several Jewish women resistance fighters who were tortured by the Gestapo, something that hasn't been talked about very much. Also in Krakow, we can say that beyond their poetic voices, their strategy, their leadership, they also conformed to a dual leadership model, first written about by historian Avihu Ronen, where women worked with their husbands in these youth movements and took on different sets of responsibility, each equally important. And again, the women often working on communication and building morale and shared values. Further, while the origins of Jewish resistance in many youth groups was often linked to Zionism and love of Israel, in Krakow there was also a great deal of religiosity, including Shabbat dinners that are discussed in Justyna's narrative and Gusta's memoir, as well as in other sources, and also fasting in the death camp by its members. As the setting of Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List, Krakow is a city that is familiar to nearly anyone with an interest in the Holocaust. I am particularly honored to be leading this discussion today with two esteemed historians, one in Israel and one in Poland. And I will now turn to Dr. Edyta Gawron and ask her to share her thoughts about women and resistance in Krakow, and particularly to help us understand the lives of Jewish women and the community in Krakow before the war. Can you tell us what factors you think it helped to enable the resistance in Krakow to flourish?
Thank you, Lori. Thank you for the introduction, and I will make sure that you can see my screen as it was not clear whether it will be showing from yours or mine, but I guess you can see it. Thank you. Thank you to the New Krakow Friendship Society for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk about Krakow to Krakowians. I would just briefly talk about the pre-war Krakow and the role the Zionist movement play in Krakow before the Second World War, but also what was the situation of women who later on joined the resistance. So this will be quite important to understand the background of the resistance during the Holocaust. First of all, I'm starting with Nowy Dziennik, the Zionist daily that was published in Krakow, just to give you an idea of some changes in the pre-war situation. Of course, Krakow Jewish community was part of the larger Polish Jewish society of almost 3.5 million Jews living in pre-war Poland. And Krakow itself had quite large group of Jews that made about 25% of the local population. Approximately 60 to 65,000 Jews live in Krakow in different pre-war years. And this community was diverse. It was changing, and there were several factors that also made changes for young generation, like access to education, like being exposed to different political organizations, like the intergenerational discussion about what is important to the Jews, to the Jewish community, but also to Poland and Polish community, because many Polish Jews living in particular living in Krakow, felt this strong connection to Poland as well. So there was certain discussion about what is important and what should be changing. And one of the platforms for such discussion was Nowy Dziennik, the new daily, which was published surprisingly by the Zionists in Polish, and that means that it was accessible also for non-Hebrew speakers or non-Yiddish speakers, like it was the case of other Jewish newspapers. And certainly the whole circle that was responsible for Nowy Dziennik, New Daily, was the group of intellectuals, political leaders who were supporting the general Zionist movement. And when you look at the activists, the leaders, it was mainly men. So it was not so open to the female activism within the Zionist organizations. However, there were multiple Zionist youth organizations that had different approach to young women, and they certainly opened the doors for young female activists as well. And women, young women in Krakow, young Jewish women, had access already to not only the primary and secondary education, but also to higher education at the university. And their perception of what they can do in life was changing. And certainly some of them got attracted by many social, political organizations that emerged in Krakow. And this included various types of Zionist organizations, but also other political parties, and other political views were represented among those active among Jewish youth in Krakow. And what was really important for shaping new generation in Krakow was the fact that it was a very egalitarian approach, that both men and women were included in leadership, that both men and women were also active in some parts of education activities that so far were considered as only for boys or men. And one of the most new, the most attractive activities included sport activities, agricultural activities, military or paramilitary trainings. And that was part of Zionist organizations, but also later on of others. So here we can see some photographs of young Krakowian Jews involved in some activities, and later on many of them made it all the way to Eretz Israel. And of course, this means that Krakowian Jews also started to prepare to establish some new infrastructure for Jewish life. So Jewish life didn't limit itself to the religious headquarters in Kazimierz, the Jewish district, but it also spread around Krakow, and it included, beside the synagogues, also many headquarters of Jewish social and political and educational and cultural organizations. But it also included places like small agricultural farms named kibbutz by those who were preparing to make aliyah, by those who were certainly training to establish the new Jewish state. And here is the example of such kibbutz in Bonarka of Krakow, where some of the young people were training. Of course, this agricultural physical activity was very often combined with preparation for the emigration, but also with some basic military training. That's why it was later on very useful to have some group of young people who knew how to defend themselves, who knew how to organize the groups, who knew how to get some weapons, who knew what to do in general. And that was also very important for some connections that were made prior to the Second World War with the non-Jewish partners, with the non-Jewish organizations, including Polish political leaders. And in general, it was the certain approach of those young Zionists who, on one hand, were preparing for the new life, but also they were very often representing some assimilated groups, assimilated in the way of the language they speak, the familiarity with non-Jewish cultures. But of course, the whole diversity of Zionist organization can be described at great length. We have limited time, so I will just focus on Akiva or Akiba movement that was for example, focusing on keeping Jewish tradition, but at the same time, it was very open and very modern in the activities offered to the young people. And certainly, other organizations were having different approach to assimilation or communism. So that's why those young Jews who started with Akiva, they later on made it to other organizations like as well, or they were responsible for some merging process with other organizations that had this Zionist profile prior to the Second World War. And this had enormous impact on the wartime experience. I mean, the fact that these young Jews from Krakow had some training, had some group binding, had some extra activities, certainly formed the group of people who were feeling responsible for the community, who had some values that they wanted to follow, and they were also brave enough to follow what was considered dangerous. Among them, there were people like already mentioned Gola Mire, or there were people like Maria Hochberg, known as Marianska as well, who was not the part of Akiva movement, but she was still active before the war, and she became active on so-called Aryan side, outside of the ghetto, and active in the resistance as well. And I would like to mention just random girls and young women in Krakow ghetto who certainly showed some resistance in various ways, not necessarily armed resistance or political activity, but they were active in their own way, growing up immediately when the situation demanded it. And I'm using here the slide with Janina Fischler, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of young women who were brave, who showed their acts of responsibility and certainly resistance. And all of them had something in common, that they didn't have enough experience to really fight the fight they were fighting. So they were aware of that. But what was important, it was not to give up at the beginning. And I will stop here.
Okay, well, that will give us a lot to build on. Thank you so much, Edyta. And I think it can't be emphasized enough how that the resistance that these women took part in necessitated training, and it wasn't the act of, they all insisted that it wasn't about individual heroism, but about a group and the shared values of that group. And that's what gave them the courage. So I think if we're thinking about resistance and fighting back against hate today, I think those are really critical lessons. And I'm going to turn now to Sheryl Ochayon from Echoes and Reflections to build on this. I want to ask you about your research at Yad Vashem and how you've written and discussed the resistance movements in Krakow, in other cities, in Auschwitz. What do you see as some of the most inspiring moments in the lives of these remarkable women in Krakow? And why do you think this topic is important today in relation to your own work?
First of all, thank you, Lori, and thank you very much to the New Krakow Friendship Society for having me, and thanks to Edyta for all of the depth that she went into just now, because like you said, we're going to build on that. Why is all this important? I think you said why it's important, Lori. It's a very important message for today. The fact that women can have leadership roles is a huge message because we're talking about a time close to 80 years ago when things were very different. The Me Too movement did not exist then, right? And men were the ones who traditionally had leadership roles. Women were relegated to roles, traditional female roles, taking care of the family, supporting their husbands, supporting the men. It was a very, completely different society then. And the fact that even so long ago, and in the midst of all of the conditions that we're going to be talking about, because these adverse, horrible conditions, the conditions of the ghetto, the Krakow ghetto, which was a tiny ghetto, so overcrowded that you could have, 10 people in a room, people sleeping in a staircase, that type of thing. The fact that in conditions like this, these women refused to put their hands up. They refused to lie down. They refused to take it. They were part of the resistance together with the men. That's a huge message, I think. Now, I don't remember whether you asked me about this, but I'm going to go ahead and start talking about Gusta because we have to get to
Should I pull up your slides as well?
Would you? That would be great. That would be wonderful. So this one is just a promo slide. Because I have to throw in my 2 cents about Echoes and Reflections. That's where I'm coming from at Yad Vashem these days. Echoes and Reflections is a great program with comprehensive lesson plans that are already made for those of you out there who are teachers. And we provide these great materials with which you can teach middle and high school. And we're going to start talking about lower grades now also. This is just some of the statistics. We've been around for a while. We've reached over, at this point, over 80,000 educators. This must be an old slide. But the biggest number on that slide is the 98%. That was all the way at the bottom, because 98% of the educators who have been exposed to us, thanks, Lori, would recommend Echoes to their educators. Yes, not related to anything, but okay. So the promo being done, let's get into the substance here. And thanks for that. So what you had happening was in World War II starts, Krakow is invaded very quickly by the Germans. The ghetto starts to exist by March of 1941. Now, we have to talk about youth movements, and Edyta started us off with that, I think, in a wonderful way. What's the story with youth movements, and why are they so important to this story? What we have to remember is, first of all, that these are people who are growing up together. Some of the main leaders in these youth movements, they became members of the youth movements when they were 13, 14, 15 years old. So they grew up together in the youth movements. They went on trips to the mountains. They were kind of the word commune does not really describe it fully, but there was a big bond between them, and that was how they knew that they could trust each other. They could rely on each other. And that becomes a very important facet of life in the ghetto, where you never knew who was ready to betray who to the Germans to get some kind of reward. which sadly happened in the ghettos, and especially in the Krakow ghetto because it was so small. So the Akiba youth movement that Edyta mentioned was a Zionist youth movement, and really what they were all about was education. Remember, you're looking at the faces of, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds who were involved. Their whole world was instilling this sense of pride in the Jewish youth of Krakow, instilling this pride because there was a lot of anti-Semitism on the streets in Poland. And when the war starts, of course, it becomes worse because the Germans are trying to humiliate them and to put them down, and all the rules and regulations that are restricting their lives. What they're trying to do here is just help the Jews, the youth, keep their heads above water, and give them an aura of pride in their Jewishness. Now, the woman that I want to talk about, of course, is circled in red on the screen. Her name is Gusta or Tova Davidson. She later marries Shimshon Draenger, who is standing right next to her. And so she's got really 4 names. We call her Gusta or Tova Davidson Draenger, but her code name in Akiba was Justyna. And in the form of Justyna, she writes a narrative, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in a second. Just as far as the quote that you see on your screen, let me just capture this for a second, because what's very important here is to understand the revolt, the uprising, the armed resistance that happens in the Krakow ghetto was not an act of desperation. It was not an act of, what do we do? We're throwing up our hands. It was very carefully thought out and considered. Gola Mira, who Edyta showed you, who was connected to the communist movement, spoke a lot with Shimshon Draenger and with Dolek Libeskind, who's on the far right side of this photo. And she is the one who is credited with having talked to them about, we got to do something. We got to put on some armed resistance because the Germans aren't going to let the Jews live. And the idea was, if we're going to die anyway, then we're going to die fighting. We're not going to die without dignity. We are going to die of our own choosing, in a way of our own choosing. And so Dolek Libeskind is credited with this expression, from our road, there is no turning back. We are fighting for 3 lines in history, if only to show that Jewish youth did not go like sheep to the slaughter. In other words, we are not going to lie down and take it. We are going to decide what our fates will be. And the reason why I love the story of Gusta so much, and you can advance the slide, Lori, just, some photos of her, because they were also, and not only were their souls beautiful, right, but they were also on the outside, they were also physically beautiful. This is Shimshon Draenger and Gusta, who were married in February of 1940. They were a couple from their teenage years. They both grew up in Akiba. And their love story is one of these amazing love stories. And there are a lot of amazing love stories in the Holocaust. That's another theme that I go gaga over, love stories in the Holocaust, because you just don't expect them in the midst of all of this the horrible atrocities and what's happening to the Jews, that people could actually fall in love. But that's what happened. So as I said, these 2 were together from their teenage years, and they pledged to each other that if one of them was caught and taken by the Germans, the other one would give themselves up, because they couldn't live without each other, which, if you're a romantic like I am, that's something that you just, it's a pretty amazing thing. And the truth is that Gusta gave herself up 3 times because she wanted to share Shimshon's fate. She wanted to share his fate with, she wanted to be where he was. So these are just a couple more pictures with Minka Libeskind, Dolek's little sister. And if you advance the slide one more time, Lori, just this incredible quote. The leadership that Gusta has and that she takes over for herself, I think she really comes into her own when she's not with her husband, when she is in prison. She is arrested. One of the times that she's arrested at the beginning of January 1943 is after the Tsiganeria operation that Lori discussed, which was this incredible act of uprising, of resistance against the Germans when they least expected it. December 22nd, 1942. Krakow was was the capital of the general government. Akiba, the underground, the fighting organization, understood there would be a lot of Germans there. They would all be doing Christmas shopping. They would be going to cafes, and they picked that moment to strike outside the ghetto. I won't go into all the details, just to say that no one believed that it was Jews who had carried out this mission, not just because they disguised themselves, but because they couldn't even believe that Poles would do something like this. A lot of people were walking around saying that it had to be the work of Russian parachutists, because nobody could get over it. There were grenades that were tossed into officers' clubs. There were flags, Polish flags that were hung on the river. There were flowers that were put on the statue of Adam Mickiewicz, who was a Polish poet. The city was chaotic. There were, flyers everywhere. Fight with us, stand up against the Germans. And it's when she's arrested after this incredible operation that in her jail cell in Helzlov prison, the wing of Montelupich that was for women, she's in a prison cell with probably 50 other women. And this is when she decides, she comes into her own as a leader, and she decides, who knows what's going to happen to this movement? Everybody could be dead tomorrow. They're all waiting for execution. They're constantly being tortured. They're constantly being interrogated, woken up in the middle of the night for all kinds of spurious reasons. She decides she is going to write a history of the movement. And not only that, she is tense and she's nervous that, God forbid, she could be called from her cell tomorrow to be executed, and then she won't be finished. And what she does, she was really tortured, severely tortured. She actually, sometimes she writes and sometimes she dictates 4 copies of this narrative. We call it Justyna's narrative, so that one of them will remain, which was also a very prescient thing to do. Very smart, because only one of those copies remains and was ever found, and only parts of it. So it was a very intuitive thing for her to do. And what she writes is this, you see this quote: "If we don't act now, history will condemn us forever. Whatever we do, we're doomed. But we can still save our souls. The least we can do now is leave a legacy of human dignity that will be honored by someone someday." So this webinar is really doing exactly what she meant to do. We are taking her writings and we're taking the story and we are sharing it and we are bringing it forward, because it's important to hear these stories and to know that there was resistance despite everything, and that women were a big part of it. So I think I'm probably over my 7 allotted minutes, so I'll stop here.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
this is the diary written on pieces of toilet paper, I should point out, because all of this stuff is just, it should be right out of a movie. Written on pieces of toilet paper with pencils that were smuggled into the prostitutes who were sharing her cell, or the criminals who were sharing her cell. Really unbelievable stuff.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. That was really fascinating. A great portrait of one of the most important women fighters in the Holocaust. Let me turn back to Edyta and ask you, what kind of obstacles do you think there are, institutional and intellectual, for studying the courage of Jewish women in the Holocaust? And how is your own work informed by the example of Jewish women during the Holocaust? And if you want to speak a little bit more about one particular woman, that would be welcome as well.
Thank you, Lori, for this question. Of course, the whole issue of the fate of women during the Holocaust has not been properly researched for many decades after the Holocaust. It's been only recently that the role of women in everyday life, in resistance, in all organized and individual forms of activity is fully appreciated and researched and publicized and in some way promoted. And it's thanks to the progress in gender studies and all the efforts to write her story, not just his story of the Holocaust. So it's this new trend acknowledging the role of women. I think it's also happening because more and more female historians are involved, who identify much easier with women during the Holocaust, but also in any other periods of history, in any other circumstances. So I think it's the changes nowadays that facilitated the research on women. We have different sensitivity to the history, to different perspectives. We also search for that. We dig the archives, searching for the bits and pieces on the biography of women which were not acknowledged properly in the encyclopedias, in the textbooks, in the works on the Holocaust. So I think it's the new generation of historians that are focusing on that. And it's not only female, but also male historians who are now changing their perspective. So I think that was one obstacle. I also see it as the role of the leaders. In many organizations, Jewish organizations, but also non-Jewish, it was the men who were the leaders. So somehow automatically people focus on those who were leading the organizations. In case of some organizations during the Holocaust, Jewish organizations, we have several people who are not men, traditionally men, but there are women like Golda Meir. She is one of the examples of a woman who is strong, who is negotiating with male partners from various organizations, not only Jewish, but also non-Jewish, Polish Workers' Party that was supporting some of the actions during the Holocaust. Of course, it's not easy. It's rather difficult to have this kind of discussions and this kind of cooperations. And, if we dig a little bit deeper, we also see the private life behind. Like Golda Meir had to struggle with her own loss. She lost her son. She forgot about that. She overcame the personal tragedy, and she was focused on fighting. And I think if we look at these stories, there are not only romantic stories, but also those tragedies that didn't break the people, didn't break these women. And I think this is quite important. And so Golda Meir, Gusta Draenger, or Justyna are just exceptional examples, but we have to also remember about others, sometimes nameless messengers, people who are smuggling, women who are smuggling all sorts of things to the ghetto, outside of the ghetto. We are also we have to focus on, as I mentioned already, all these young girls who were not grown up enough to join political organizations, to be seriously considered for military actions, but they did their fight. They were involved in sabotage, they were involved in smuggling, so it was important. And we cannot look at them only as the victims. We have to look at them as heroes, in this case, heroines. So I think this is the new narrative. We have to notice the acts of heroism, whether it's political activity, some following the religious values, or following some other messages for the future. I think you need to turn.
Do you want to pull up your last slide to show the hero's place in Poland today, and just tell us about that? Because that was going to be my next question to Sheryl and to you about this framework of heroism and what can be done to expand awareness of these women.
Yeah, so here you can see the square, the main square of Krakow Ghetto. It used to be called Zgody Square before the Second World War. Now it's named after the heroes of the ghetto, Ghetto Heroes Square. And this square itself, it's also part of the commemoration of the resistance. There is this green house in the center, which used to be the location of one of the resistance cells in the ghetto. However, we have to emphasize that most of the resistance in Krakow, Jewish resistance in Krakow, was outside of the ghetto, which is kind of a phenomenon. It's not comparable to Warsaw. It's different. And that's why it required cooperation with non-Jewish organizations. And unfortunately, it's also a sensitive issue because there were some actions like Cyganeri action mentioned by Sheryl that it's now claimed also by the Polish resistance. So we have this ongoing struggle when the commemoration is concerned. But here the Ghetto Heroes Square is commemorated for the history of the ghetto, but I think the name heroes is important because we have different name used. For example, at the site of Płaszów camp, we have the martyrs. So there is the distinction of the role of the Jews during the Holocaust.
Thank you.
And here you can see some details of the commemoration of the square with some of the students coming there and sort of acknowledging the role of this commemoration. And we see the pharmacy under the eagle in the background. So this was also one of the locations for the resistance, the meeting, the transit point, and more and more.
Thank you so much, Edyta. It's really helpful to be able to picture how it's being taught in Poland and also to hear about some of the controversies. And Sheryl, I just wanted to ask you also about heroism. You know, why do you think this framework is inspiring for a new generation?
I think Edyta covered the idea of heroism pretty well. And, you know, I mean, I'll just say again, you're always looking for a hero. Aren't we always looking for a hero? I mean, even in our daily lives, we're always looking for somebody who stands up to the bad guys. We're always looking for somebody who can be a role model that way. And I think these stories are just, you know, just unbelievable. The story of Krakow, especially because it's forgotten. And this isn't just the women's side of the story. This is the story of the Krakow ghetto uprising in general. Everybody knows about Warsaw. Anybody who takes a Holocaust class hears about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Everybody reads the Diary of Anne Frank, right? But there are very few people around who have ever heard of Justyna's narrative. And there are very few people around who have ever heard of the Krakow, thank you, Lori, who have ever heard of the Krakow ghetto, the armed resistance in the Krakow ghetto. And that's such a shame because they are unique. They are completely unique. For instance, you know, just talking about the resistance aspect of it, Krakow is the first ghetto that brought the fight to the Germans. In other words, didn't wait for the Germans to come inside and fought back from inside the ghetto, but actually, as Edyta said, moved out of the ghetto and fought the Germans outside the ghetto. And think about how their minds were working. Why did they do this? Because they understood that if they fought from inside the ghetto, there could be collective punishment of everyone in the ghetto, and they didn't want to risk it. They didn't want to risk bringing this punishment on all of the other Jews, so they moved outside the ghetto, even though they had to conceal their Jewishness. Now, they're fighting to leave a legacy that the Jews did not go like sheep to the slaughter. So how ironic is it that they have to cover their Jewishness in order to move outside the ghetto and fight? So that's one piece of the uniqueness of the Krakow story. And the uniqueness of Justyna's narrative, you know, a diary like Anne Frank is, you know, a teenage girl who's considering life around her. We all know the book. Justyna's narrative has, first of all, her writing is just so lyrical and so beautiful, with sunsets and the forest and the but she's also writing the history of her movement, and she's also writing about things that we don't necessarily think about. For instance, one of the things she writes about is how difficult it is for these female couriers, for the women who went back and forth between the ghettos, how difficult it is to leave a ghetto. People think, okay, you just take off your armband. No, it's much more difficult than that. She writes about how the Jewish face is kind of scarred by all of the humiliation and all of the oppression. And in order to take off your armband, you have to regain your confidence first. You can't just take off, that's just a piece of cloth. You have to change your whole mindset. And she also talks about how it was the youth, why it was the youth who were the ones who fought back, because the older people were oppressed for so long that they were so weary, and the youth were the ones who wanted to fight back, even though paradoxically it could have led to their deaths sooner rather than later. You would think that they would want to stay alive. So there's a lot of wisdom in this narrative in general, and that's why this is a story. These are stories, the women's side of the story and the uprising in Krakow in particular. These are stories that just, they need to be told. They need to be told and heard.
Yes, I have to agree that I think that we haven't heard enough the names of the women of Krakow, of the resistors in Krakow. And more generally, I think some of these problems are very unique to Krakow. And then others, like thinking of Vitka Kempner in Vilna, who also had, some of them had to also disguise Jewish resistance, again, because of collective reprisal. So some of them were in common with other, forms of Jewish resistance by women, and some of them were unique to Krakow. So it's very interesting. But certainly Justyna's narrative, Gusta Tova's diary, is an exceptional source for understanding the Holocaust. And I think what's disappointing is that that historians of the Holocaust writing about responses and the timing of the final solution haven't better integrated these sources into our general understanding of how the Holocaust happened. Because I think there's plenty of opportunities for some of these issues to come up. And to sort of bring forth some of the poetry and the flair, the insights of Gusta, we've asked Anna to do a short reading. Again, when Gusta writes this, she's 26 years old. It's written in prison, as Sheryl was pointing out. And this particular excerpt captures her feeling about the power of shared values and the bonds of mutual aid, something that other female leaders like Zivia Lebetkin, the highest ranking woman in the Warsaw Ghetto, who I'm doing a lot of research on, she emphasized this as well as the source of strength. So Gusta writes this in the most poetic terms, beginning with an analogy between Jewish attacks on Nazis, with its crescendos and pauses to music. And so, Anna, will you read this for us?
Yes, thank you. They could look back at their work and think of it as a polyphonic composition, with the separate melodies fusing into a glorious harmony. The fused harmonic pitches rise higher and higher until they crescendo in a climactic chord, a confluence of reverberating tones. A silent pause must follow each resonant chord to give the mighty tones their proper effect. The orchestra is silent. The artists rest, but the music still resonates in the listener's ears. When the climactic chord stops resonating and its last trace fades into silence as if retreating to a far-off place, the violinist takes up his instrument, and his bow caresses the hushed strings once more, reviving the suspended melody. At first, the awkward melody emerges pianissimo, but as the winding strands start interweaving again, the melodic structure soars once more, climbing even higher until it resolves itself into another climactic chord, after which there must be another pause and another silence. That is what the movement's work was like. As I write these words, many fighters are still living. These are fighters who jump from a dark alley, deliver a blow, confiscate a weapon, then disappear into the thick of night. Some deliver printed flyers on busy streets, trying to rouse people from their apathy. Others work like moles, spying on the secret police, doing their part in defeating the seed of freedom, defending the seed of freedom. All carry out their assignments, fearing nothing in this world, desiring nothing more than an honorable death. Many of us now await this death behind the walls of this prison. Since the investigation is in process, every word I utter can still influence the fate of those using their freedom to carry on the work. So I must restrain myself. I am not yet at liberty to tell everything these fearless youth have accomplished. Every evening was crowned with heroic exploits, and each exploit thundered a resounding no in the ears of those who had appointed themselves masters of life and death over millions of defenseless people.
Thank you. And I was just answering the question in the chat that yes, this is available in English. I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who's particularly musically inclined, but when I've read this to students and faculty, they've said, you know, you can almost hear the violin music. This calls for like an opera to be written out of her diary, and yet it's really not been one of the forms of testimony about the Holocaust that has been circulated the way it could or should have, given how inspiring it is, not just as a piece of literature, but again, as a form of leadership, as a manual for strategic thinking in resistance to hate and Nazism. And it's just very inspiring. And thank you for reading it so beautifully. So we can open up now to questions and answers from our audience to specific panelists. If anybody wants to put those questions in the chat. I just want to mention that somebody another scholar who's on was one of our attendees, Yitzhak Karim, has written quite a lot about female resistance fighters in Greece, Sephardic heroines, which I think is an amazing topic as well. And just saying that, well, that for one thing, this certainly didn't appear in Spielberg's film. I don't know, Edyta, can you tell us, is any of this in the exhibit in Schindler's Factory? I can't remember now. Was there anything there about women and resistance?
Yes, there are some sections on the resistance. However, this is not the main topic, or it's not focused on in the general picture of the ghetto. There are members of the Jewish fighting organizations. There are some individuals from the ghetto who resisted, who were part of it. Of course, the names that were mentioned today are there. But again, the section on the ghetto, it's just part of the Holocaust in the exhibition, so it's not very large. There is not enough space to show all the actions and all the connections and all the bravery. But of course, there is a resistance, and there are female members of these fighting organizations.
Do you think there would be any interest in doing murals like they did in Warsaw for one of the Yom HaShoahs? Is that something that anybody has talked about to honor some of these women that we're talking about, since you're there?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a need for that. We have the ongoing mural projects, including the Jewish street art at Galicia Jewish Museum. And as it was mentioned in the comment that the resistance in Krakow is only now discovered, I have with me the catalog of the exhibition at Galicia Jewish Museum many years ago, focus on the resistance in Krakow. So I think this topic was covered, but maybe it didn't resonate enough in the wider audience. I think we need to talk about it more. We need to commemorate the sites of the resistance. When I walk around the area of the ghetto and I stop at the locations of the resistance cells, I see that the groups that are stopping by are mainly Israeli groups. So we need to change it. We need to include this narrative on the resistance also for non-Jewish, non-Israeli audience.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can just ask our panelists about your personal connection to Krakow and what has inspired you to study these women. Maybe Sheryl, if you want to start.
I have no personal connection to Krakow. I guide there. And that is how I became aware of this story. And it's, I mean, every time I guide there and I tell the story, I always say it needs to be made into a movie because it's just too crazy. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. The fact that, there are so many points in the story that I didn't have time to go into. I'll go into them for 2 seconds. The fact that that Gusta and Shimshon Draenger were both supposed to be executed on the same day. They both managed to escape. They both managed to make their way to the woods. They both, after all of the other fighters pretty much of Akiba had been killed, they went on and published. They had been publishing an underground newspaper. They had been the main writers and publishers of this underground newspaper. Every Friday, 250 copies of this newspaper came out. They were passed hand to hand and read by hundreds of people. And even after everyone had been killed or imprisoned by the Germans, and they knew that they were probably, there were very few of them left, they went on and published more copies of this newspaper until, eventually they were also caught and killed. So there are just so many. I mean, this is a story that just captures your imagination, just like that.
Yeah, and actually, we didn't have time to talk as much. Like the first time he's arrested, it's for publishing a newspaper with a lot of anti-fascist writings by non-Jewish women. And one particular woman from Austria, I'm not remembering her name, but I think it's just like, I think that's a whole nother angle to explore, is this dynamic between the Jewish and the non-Jewish resistance movements and efforts at anti-fascism.
Mhm.
And Edyta, I just wanted to ask if you wanted to add anything about, obviously you have a strong personal connection. And also if I still wanted to hear a few more words about why you were so fascinated by Janina's diary.
Yes, so my personal connection to Krakow is very simple. I live in Krakow for most of my life. I wasn't born in Krakow though. I've lived there for now over 25 years. So it's my hometown. And as a historian, I always have this strong connection to the local history. And that's why I'm focusing on Krakow, Jewish Krakow community. And I've been writing on that and teaching on Krakow Jewish history for many years, and of course I see the need to show this history, to acknowledge the individuals, but also to show the continuity of some Jewish story, his story, and her story as well. Being part of JCC Krakow, I see that most of the survivors who are among us are now women. So I think this women bring the female narrative to the attention of the community members, but also to general audience. So I think that's part of my motivation. Living in Krakow, being part of the community, being sensitive to the history, and also remembering some of the people. Meeting some of the people who are no longer with us, like people who were in the ghetto of Krakow, who shared with me amazing stories, and this resonates. It's different than reading just the document in the archive. Once you hear personal story, it lives with you. It's like you carry on this story and you try to include it in the narrative. And that is the story of Janina Fischler. I met her in person. I was walking with her around the ghetto, and I was really shocked by her perspective of the life in the ghetto as the young girl. She was 8 or 9 years old, and her narrative was very adult. And she showed me the places she lived in, and she escaped from the ghetto through the sewers, which is one of the few stories. Not many people managed to do so. And she was brave enough to separate from her older brother as the moment they reached the area outside of the ghetto, which for me was the most shocking fragments, that they met. He saved her from the ghetto, and then the moment they went out of the ghetto, they said goodbye immediately, because with the blink of their eyes, they understood that the chances of survival for each of them is separately. So these stories, you understand the whole experience of the Holocaust when you hear to the stories, not necessarily of killing people, but just the fear, the circumstances. Sometimes you don't need the drastic details to be there to feel the situation.
Thank you. So beautifully said. Is there any last question? We might have time for just one more. A question about a list somewhere of the resistance fighters. I put one of the lists that I had found, particularly of fighters from the ZOB from an old Polish source on the slide. But Edyta, can you answer that? Is there a list somewhere, particularly of the women who are considered part of the resistance?
I think there are several publications which list the resistance fighters from Krakow, and the book by Bieberstein is one of them. There are several publications based on that. There is the catalog of the exhibition at Galicia Jewish Museum that lists them. I believe the at least partial list is also available in the memorial book published by Krakow Friendship Society. So you have multiple sources for this list. Are they complete? I don't know. I mean, we will never be 100% sure that they are complete, because there are many people who were part of the resistance effort but never listed in the documents or testimonies. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much, both of you. I did want to ask, is it possible to get that Krakow catalog somehow? Is it online at all? Have you considered utilizing it?
I'm not sure if it is online, but I guess we can make at least parts of it available.
Okay, well, we might reach out to you to do that, because it does sound like a really important source. And were there any specific songs associated with the Krakow? Now we know there's quite a lot of poetry, but was there any specific songs that were associated with the Krakow resistance?
I think there were several songs sung in the ghetto, but I think the poetry made into the songs by Mordechai Geburtig is the one that resonated in Krakow ghetto the most.
Yes, yeah.
I also do want to say, in connection with songs, when you start listening to testimonies, you start to hear, for instance, I think it's Elsa Lapa's testimony, where she talks about how the women in the cell in prison, where Gusta was writing the narrative, sang constantly to the extent that, and they were not allowed to go outside the prison yard for exercise. They exercised in an internal courtyard of the prison. So, and they were constantly singing to the extent that she remembers hearing a Polish prisoner asking a guard, how can they be singing all the time? Because, you know, the conditions were so bad in the prison and they were just constantly singing. She also remembered a song that it turns out that Gusta translated a lot of poetry. She translated Esbrent, which was Mordechai Gebertig's poem about the Pshitik uprising of 1936. She translated that from Yiddish to Polish. She translated a number of other things. There was a song that became the anthem of these women in the prison cell that was actually based on a German song. And if I remember correctly, it's something like, "Our minds and our thoughts are free." And that became their anthem. Gusta translated it to Polish, and they sang it all the time to give them more hope and more strength.
Okay, well, I might reach out to you. I'm really interested. That's a great question about songs. And so I think now we're going to wrap it up with a few closing words. But I just want to say that I think it's clear that we've only just scratched the surface of this topic, both for Krakow, where there were dozens, if not hundreds of women involved in one way or another with resistance, both armed, and certainly thousands involved with educational and cultural and spiritual resistance. We've only scratched the surface of hearing about religion and how these women displayed religious resistance, which is a really fascinating topic as well. And the Zionist, passions, I think, are also really still understudied in relation to the Holocaust. So there's a lot more to do, including really using this word heroines. And I hope that everyone who's here will not hesitate to help us redefine this notion of heroic so that it is inclusive of these brave and courageous Jewish women and non-Jewish women who helped fight the Nazis. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Hello, my name is Steve Radwin, and I am the president of the New Krakow Friendship Society. Thank you, Lori, Sheryl, Edyta, for your expertise and giving us a glimpse into the lives of women resistance fighters and helping us to fulfill our duty to never forget. On behalf of myself, Elizabeth, Anna, and the entire membership of the New Krakow Friendship Society, we truly appreciate you. I would also like to thank Jakub Nowakovsky, the director of the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, whose thoughtful suggestion and efforts brought Edyta to our panel. Thank you to all who joined us today. A recording of this discussion will be available for viewing on YouTube, and a link will be sent in a follow-up email and will be on our website. Please share this important presentation with your family and friends. We appreciate all of you who have donated already and hope that and for those of you who haven't, we hope that after watching this presentation, you will consider doing so. The support of survivors through the Welfare Fund is one of the mainstays of the New Krakow Friendship Society since its founding in 1965. So please use the link on the chat or on our homepage, newkrakow.org. Thank you again, and until next time. Good night.